for the ones who come to the engagement process through the comprehensive plan, but all the way through. If you think about what the comprehensive plan does and what the zoning ordinance does, the comprehensive plan is sort of your wish list of what you want everything to look like when you're done. So if you're looking at a pizza, it's the one thing that how you want it, what you want your order to be. And then the zoning ordinance is going to tell us the recipe for how to do it. We get the city that we regulate in our ordinance. We may have aspirational goals in a comprehensive plan, but to the extent that Lexington is a car-centric city, it's because our ordinance almost mandates it and requires it. And so we're going to talk about a little bit when it comes to parking. We're going to talk about breaking the cycle of sprawl, and one of the elements that keeps that cycle moving is parking. And so again, as Brittany said, we're talking about changes here to our zoning ordinance. We call them zoning ordinance text amendments as by law, and we obnoxiously refer to these things in an acronym form as ZOTAs. The zoning ordinance is our rule book for development and land use. All of the projects that we're working on have worked on in the last 5 years. You can find those on the imaginelexington.com website under the regulation changes. We have a project page for every ongoing text amendment that we're working on, as well as a few that have been completed in the past. And so here's where we start talking about structural inequity in our zoning ordinance. There's three primary components that make up development, any development. You have your building area, your square footage, your building footprint. You have the open space requirements, and then you have your vehicular use area, your parking. Those three things pretty much determine the shape, the form, everything about a development. And our ordinance has always prioritized pretty much over everything abundant free parking. First and foremost, we start with where we're going to put all the cars. That leaves a little bit of room for open space, and then it dictates the design of the sites. It dictates the construction, the size, everything falls in pretty much after where's the car going to go. And so what we're trying to do with all of the text amendments that we've been working on over the last few years is to flip that on its head, talk about who's going to use the sites, how do we serve them, and then build that development. And then we work in the vehicle, we work in the car. We still provide safe access. We still provide safe spaces to park. We still have all of these things, but we need to make sure that the development is being thought of from the approach of how's it going to serve everyone, not just how's it going to serve everyone who has a car and where they're going to put their car. And so the parking text amendment, I'll go through a couple of things here real quick. We sort of lay out the foundation for parking reform, the why we're doing parking reform, and then I'm going to be at a little higher level than we were at the Planning Commission on what we're recommending, our initial draft and recommendation is for parking reform. I'll walk everybody through that. And I want to make sure everyone knows that all of this content and the slides that were given to the Planning Commission are on that website. The presentation's there. So if I don't cover anything, or if you have more questions, make sure you check out the website and get whatever you need there, and then contact us if you have questions. So I'll jump right in here a little bit. We start with, from the comprehensive plan, we start with the goals and objectives. We have goals and objectives that talk about supporting infill and redevelopment, providing well-designed neighborhoods and communities, utilizing a people-first design, designing car park areas so that they're not the primary visual component. We're trying to reduce and discourage vehicle-oriented development patterns. And again, all of this is about preservation of the urban service boundary, managed growth, trying to disincentivize sprawl, and try to create new flexible parking and shared parking arrangements. Some of these things you may not think of as related to parking when it comes to building good neighborhoods or adding density, but some of these things are not possible unless we address the parking. And so one of the things we ask people to do when we talk about parking is to try to take your personal preferences out of your thought process about how the city should regulate parking. We know that if you're everybody in this call, if they go out to a parking space, they ask themselves, where do they want to park in a parking lot? Do you want to be somewhere close? Do you want to be in the back where your car won't get its door dinged? Do you want to be somewhere else further away? Do you want to walk? Do you want to be in the shade because you don't want your car hot when you get back to it? Do you want to be near the walkway? You want to be near the cart return? These are very personal things that everybody is making in an individual moment. And they all want the exact space they want. And so they come to parking regulations thinking about where they want to park. but we have to sort of take a step back. We have to look at it from a bigger picture and talk about how is parking being served. And so we talk a little bit here about the history of parking in this country. We started out where, in the late 20s, early 30s, very few people owned a car, but in the 30s, we passed our first zoning ordinance. In the 50s, we said that, the BOA, the Board of Adjustment, had the authority to allow uses without parking, but eventually we took that ability away from the Board of Adjustment. And in the 60s, the APA, the American Planning Association, started recommending more and more parking. And I'm going to go into the process of how that happened here in a few minutes. By the late 60s, about 83% of Lexingtonians owned a car, and we adopted parking standards that reflected everyone's willingness and desire, when land was cheap and available, for everyone to have an abundant parking wherever they went. And this is done nationally. And so it's not like Lexington stands out as sort of uniquely car-centric in any sort of way. And so then over time, because of the effect of all of these parking spaces and these things, we started amending the regulations again and again and again. And so we started out in the 70s making changes, all the way up to as recently as 2020, been making changes to our parking regulations, all to try to protect residents from the negative effects of automobiles. But what we were really regulating was we were giving relief to parking numbers, the number of spaces. That's primarily all the changes that you see here are related to how many parking spaces do we require? How do we provide regulatory relief so people can park the cars that they need? And then how do we still encourage and allow development to work in that sort of framework? And so the bottom line of our parking regulations is that they're preventing us from doing the things that we want to do, that the community has said that they want to do in the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan. That we want to provide purposeful, adaptable, and responsive parking regulations that make the city better, and also really and truly work to enhance public health and safety. And that public health and safety really and truly is the motivation for why we're coming up with a responsive parking system. We know that the average standards that are used as the genesis for setting our parking requirements generate very inaccurate predictions for individual developments. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about what we're talking about there. But really, and then finally, we want to talk about creating a system that works for all the parking users and the people who provide that parking. And so the health, safety, and welfare. So I've got two parking lots here shown in the same development, in the same zoning. And you see one development has an entirely full parking lot, could probably use some additional spaces. And right next to it, under the same zoning classification and the same type of use, a professional office use, but a bank with the drive-throughs, there's 3 cars in the parking lot. It's completely overparked and underparked. We have a situation where the ordinance sets a standard and doesn't serve either one of these businesses. It just doesn't work. We want to know if there's a better way to address the issue than the way we've always done it. That regulating the number of parking spaces has on average produced 8 parking spaces for every single vehicle in this country nationally. So everywhere, and because I'll point out in a minute here with how we come to these standards, every city is pretty much the same. That nationally, we have 8 spaces for every car. So no matter where you go, you should have 8 places to park your car. But we've not at all addressed the way the public health and safety is being served for people that are even the people who use the vehicle, much less the people who don't. So here I want to talk a little bit about the cycle of creating sprawl and how we set these parking standards. So the Institute of Transportation Engineers, the ITE, they survey peak parking demand at suburban sites that have lots of free parking, and they report that parking inventory, and they use that to set a precise parking generation rate. And so what's happened from that is that planners over the decades, and this thing's updated about every 7-8 years or so, planners set their minimum standards, the minimum based off of these averages that they find in the manual. And so then that provides, again, ample free parking. When the next ITE manual goes out and updates, they inventory again, and we've overbuilt the parking initially. They continue to update that, and it reflects more parking. And we continue to repeat this process over and over and over until planners and elected officials and appointed officials start limiting development density to ease the congestion. And what that does is, because we've put so much parking around these sites that's not used, we spread the uses further out. People have to travel further to get to one of those uses. It's not accessible to them. It's not walkable to them. And then by spreading them out and making everyone take a car, we then increase the demand there again for parking. So these average standards, if you look, here's a scatter plot for one use, the parking generation rates. You see the black dots representing a business they surveyed. You see along one axis, the square footage by 1,000 square feet. And on the other axis, you see the number of parking spaces. And if you look at that scattered plot, there's no real correlation between the number of parking spaces and the average square feet in leasable area. It doesn't really exist. So the question you have to ask yourself is, well, why do they use square footage to correlate with parking? Well, because square footage is what planners have to regulate. We can regulate the size of buildings. We do that through other public health and safety measures in zoning. We regulate the size and location of buildings. And so because that's the tool that we have, that's the correlation they're looking for. But if you look at that line of best fit where they try to set the parking standard, it doesn't hit a single user. It misses everyone. It doesn't serve any of the businesses. All we've done is set an average. It's illustrative of maybe some really broad trend if you squint real hard, but it fails in nearly every application that you apply to it. So we have these very precise numbers. They're very useful for something, but they're not useful for terms of setting what our parking regulations and requirements ought to be. So we have all this uncertainty still. So the takeaway here is that the demand for parking, it's not a function of square footage. It's not a function of bedrooms. It's not a function of the number of seats in your dining room or your floor area ratio. The demand for parking is determined by a lot of things that the government doesn't regulate in a zoning ordinance. It's your market demographics. It's your differing business models between similar uses, location. All these different locations can have vastly different needs for parking. And being honest, it's just popularity of a restaurant of different uses. We look at restaurants as a great example. No one here is going to tell me that the parking needed for a Burger King is the same as is needed for a Chick-fil-A, but our ordinance has to treat them the same. But those uses, they're not even remotely having the same land use considerations, the same public health and safety considerations are necessary between these two uses. And so a takeaway here is that we shouldn't be regulating these things strictly by the land use category and by the same standards across the board. So again, where does automobile dependency sort of and parking fall in this cycle of sprawl? The cycle that I walked you through was just a little mini cycle of the generous parking supply piece on this slide. It's just part of a bigger circle of sprawl. And so what we're looking to do is sort of break that cycle of continually adding more and more parking to every site that comes in, because all that does is keep us on the bigger cycle of sprawl. It pushes development further away. It makes us more automobile oriented in our development planning. It makes other modes of transportation less efficient. And so we have to break it somewhere. And we want to start with the amount of parking that we require. And so our goal here is to try to set up a system that is responsive to parking providers to get the amount of parking that they need on their sites. Parking is very expensive. It ranges from $5,000 a space if it's a surface lot to $50,000 a space or more if it's in a structure. We want to allow them the flexibility that helps them lower their costs, help them reduce their maintenance costs, help them serve their customers. And at the same time, we want to create standards for our parking lots. And this is where the equity part really comes in. We want to reduce the collisions within these parking lots. We want to make sure that everybody who gets out of their car and then becomes a pedestrian can get safely to their destination. We want to make sure that anywhere that we do have parking, that anywhere where a business provides parking, that cyclists and bicyclists have the same standards and thought put into their parking as any other parking space. And then we want to make sure that transit users have safe routes, again, once they become pedestrians, from their streets, their stops to their destinations as well. And so it's about making sure that every parking space in a parking lot is designed in a way that is equitably considered and is safely provided. So the framework for reform, this is the part where Valerie presented at the work session. I'm going to stomp all over it in a way that hopefully does it some dignity here, but we're talking primarily here about all these sections in the ordinance that have parking in them today. We're talking about consolidating them back into just Article 16 for general regulations for parking, and our buffers and landscaping of those parking lots, which have a big impact on the design, are rolled into Article 18, combining everything down into those two sections of the ordinance. We want the ordinance to be simpler. We want it to be more efficient. We want developers, engineers, everyone to be able to go into it, find the parking standards, have them very simple no matter what zone they're working in. So we want to restructure the regulations with a clear purpose. We want to focus on health, safety, and welfare. We want to turn wide open boulevards of parking and wide open asphalt lots into something where people can walk, where they have shade. We want to, that's, if you see here sort of what we're trying to break these things up into, we want to change them from what you see on the left to what you see on the right. So there's two major changes, and we this, no denying, this is very major. We no longer want to regulate the number of parking spaces required. We want to make it so that developers, we know that developers are going to provide parking. We know that this community demands and needs parking. We know that if we were to get rid of our parking regulations today, that people would still provide parking. And how do we know this? Because in 2016, we got rid of our parking requirements in our B6P zone, which is where Fayette Mall is located. It's where most of Hamburg is located. We got rid of it. Got rid of our minimum standards, put a maximum in. And if you, I mean, you all know what Fayette Mall looks like. It doesn't look much different. The pace of change from deregulating the number of parking spaces has been very, very slow. That's for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which is that these sites all have leases. They're very complex. It's not simple to just suddenly take up 400 parking spaces of Dillard's and build something on that site. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of work on the part of most of these built areas to redevelop some of these spaces. But they also know that their customers want parking. But we also mostly we want to make sure that if there is development that comes in, that it's not hampered and hindered by the fact that our ordinance says that they need roughly 4,000 parking spaces. That most of them go unused most of the year. The other major change that we're talking about is the addition of site design standards. We're regulating the number of parking spaces. Apologize. The number of parking spaces doesn't protect the public health and safety of our community, but regulating the site design and the layout of our parking areas does. So no longer regulating the number, we can focus on other aspects of the development. We can make it more dense and compact, safer, more accommodating for walking. But at the same time, adding these site design standards will allow us to promote safety for everyone. We want it to be flexible, but we also want it to be focused. We want to make sure that we have flexibility where we need it, but that we're intently focused on actually making a difference in the areas where our zoning ordinance really should be focused, which is on the safety of users. So again, we're looking at a trend nationally where pedestrian deaths are on the rise. I think in Lexington, I've seen a disturbing number of news stories lately of pedestrians being hit by vehicles on or near our roadways. These design standards, we want to develop them to reduce vehicle speeds in our parking lots. We're not trying to bring traffic to a halt and create gridlock. What we're trying to make it is so that the vehicles just slow down and continue moving, but that it creates better predictable circulation for pedestrians, that they know where a vehicle is going to be because we've clearly delineated it. We've guided the vehicles into a certain location. We provide, and also because this will help us provide marked and illuminated places for pedestrians to go and for crosswalks. If everyone is well aware in a parking situation where everyone's going to be and should be, then we'll reduce those opportunities for collisions with people. And again, we don't want to understate here that there is an environmental aspect to this, that there are climate benefits for our community, that it's an opportunity for us to improve our tree canopy, to reduce our heat islands, to mitigate stormwater. These have benefits for the owners and providers of the parking lots, as well as for people who use them. And that there are national funding trends that we expect to be coming out of the federal and state level that are going to encourage this sort of development. And we want to make sure that our ordinance is on the cutting edge of that and ready to receive funding for grants and projects like that. If our ordinance is more forward thinking, we think it positions us well for those sorts of funding projects. And so again, we typically have a couple of types of parking in Lexington. We have our typical low density residential, parking. We have our medium scale commercial that's sort of neighborhood oriented, and then we typically have our big box standard, our big giant parking lots. And we've broken them down into 4 types of parking lots, and this is where I started cutting a little bit of content out, so I don't want to get too much into the weeds here. This is a little more in detail on our website, but I'm going to talk primarily about the type 3 and type 4 parking lots that are really aimed at sort of anything that's around 3 acres or less or above 3 acres. And really the way we arrive at that number is that that's about the size of a city block. And so we want to make sure that the parking lot is walkable the same way that a city block is walkable. And so if you look at sort of, here's South Park, you see that standard city block in front of, say, the Best Buy area, the Staples. There's basically 2 entire city blocks of parking at South Park. And you can see from the pictures just how much of that parking is utilized. But you also see that parking is largely just wide open. We have parking lots up to 3 acres in our type 3, and then anything greater than 3 acres is a type 4 parking lot under our proposed design standards. So what you see over here at Crossroads would be a type 3. It's smaller than the city block, and it would have different standards. And so the type 3 lots, it places the majority of the parking to the rear or to the sides of buildings. It starts limiting the amount of parking that you see between the street and the buildings. It's basically a drive aisle with parking on each side, the 60 feet max. And again, it features buildings and open space at intersections instead of parking. It's about bringing buildings at our corners and holding those corners with buildings for increased interaction. It improves our internal circulation. And we're going to set some perimeter connection standards to make sure that there are places for pedestrians and transit users to get into the properties and access these parking areas and these buildings. But it also sets some standards on the maximum street frontage and things like that. Our type 4 parking lots. So here's some of the principles that we're talking about here. If you look at this parking lot and how it's different from the other big box parking lots that you see, what you see is places where the vehicles cannot just zoom straight across. You see a clear pedestrian path no matter where you park to get safely to the buildings. So we talk about breaking up the block on the right into a way where it's walkable along its entire perimeter. It has clear delineated paths for the vehicles to go and a clear delineated paths for the pedestrians to go. All of them leading back to our uses on the site. If you look at the bottom along the streets frontages, you see breaks every so often within those frontages to allow pedestrians to get through the buildings and into the developments. We're not expecting that every development will orient their development and their front doors to the street, because we know that most of the customers will be coming from the car. But we do expect that there will be engagement and activation of our public streets and our corners with structures, and that the parking will more trend towards being to the interior and to the sides of structures. And so we looked at one of our existing sites. This is the South Farm development at Nicholasville Road with the Walmart. And as you can see, it's largely the same situation. It's 2 maximum parking blocks, well, 3 really. And the only change that really would affect this development would be the creation of something that breaks up those developments down the middle to provide better, clearer access. If you see right here in the middle, it would break that up, and it would add a clearer delineation along the front. Again, this is all about increasing the pedestrian safety, is by having a place for vehicles with the sidewalks along through there. And if you think about, if you ever go to that Walmart, how you access that building, there's nowhere for pedestrians anywhere in that parking lot until you get to the front door of the Walmart, and much less along the perimeter. As you can see in this picture, no access, no sidewalks around here to get you to any of these other developments throughout the site. And this is one of our busiest transit stops, in Lexington out here at the Walmart across from the Lowe's, in that little island in the middle. There's a transit hub. And so minimal amount of retrofit is what we're talking about for most big box standards, with huge gains in terms of pedestrian safety. And in terms of the loss of parking spaces, it would be minimal compared to the number of spaces that are actually used on these sites. And here's another development that is part of the Imagine Nicholasville Road plan, where we're talking about, again, this is the Emmert Farm. This is probably a 10, 20-year horizon for the property at the corner of Man of War and Nicholasville Road, the South Farm opposite of the Walmart. This was one of our catalyst sites in the Imagine Nicholasville Road study. And if you could see what the consultants put together well before we had given them any indication of our parking text, is something that largely meets these standards. The parking is broken up, it's clearly delineated. We have active corners and parking to the interior, but it's dense. There's a lot of uses there, but all of this is focused around people being able to walk, bike, take transit, and be able to park their vehicles at this location. And so really, we're trying to regulate what's most important to the community. We're trying to enable the comprehensive plan. We're trying to increase public health and safety and welfare of our community. But we want these flexible and focused regulations that serve everyone. These changes, they set a new standard for parking, but and we can't stress this enough, that the actual effects of this will be a very gradual change over time, that no one will be rushing out to just get rid of all their parking. That we hear regularly from people that call us and say, they need more parking. Where can they get some more parking, and how can we help them on that front? So we don't expect those changes, to be radical in that regard. But we do want these regulations to be designed, again, as Brittany said at the very beginning, for people instead of vehicles. And we want to make sure that we're balancing, that everyone's needs. We're enhancing the city, and we're creating opportunities for all sorts of people. Some of the things that we're working on, we have a community parking survey on our website. I'll show that here in just a second. We're working on setting up some focus groups with the business community, as well as other people who are just interested in the parking text amendment. We'll be setting up some focus groups. We'll be sending out surveys to people. We've already started with some online video presentations on our website, as well as our social media outreach started. And honestly, civic group presentations like this are critical to us. It gets us in front of lots of people, and it also gets us, some of you here today may have neighborhoods and other interests, groups that you would like us to talk to. It's about getting the word out there and offering our services to come talk about this, what it means for you, and what it means for the community. We're still working through this with other divisions within the urban county government. And we have our own webinar series that we do called Mornings with Planning, where we bring in people from all over the country and we talk about various planning related issues and things that we're working on, but we frame them in sort of a national way. We have one on April 7th with just an absolutely stacked panel of international and national experts on parking that we hope that you'll take a look on our website and join us for that on the 7th at 9 o'clock in the morning. But our community parking survey, we're asking people to take a look at and submit to us parking lots, whether they think they are overutilized, underutilized, whether they're unsafe, anything. We want people to send them to us, because we're gonna try to point out as many of those as possible how our ordinance failed us as a community in those situations, and whether they're overparked or underparked. Or, we want to be able to illustrate to people. We think that's very illustrative to point out where the ordinance is not working and how we can do better. You don't have to leave us comments on it, but they are encouraged. And I think Ashley put that link in the chat. So please, we would ask you to take a look at that. And so the three people that are sort of the leads on this project are Jimmy Emmons, who's in our MPO and our transportation planning, and myself and Valerie Friedman. And so our contact information is here. We encourage anybody that wants to reach out to us and talk about parking. We're happy to do so at any time. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Valerie.
All right, thanks, Chris. And I'm going to share my screen now. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the other slice of the of the pie chart. So, Chris showed that pie chart at the beginning, and we saw that the building footprint and the parking and the open space is what generally takes up space on a site. So as we're thinking about these ZOTAs, as we're thinking about how to build more equitably in Lexington, we need to be thinking about all three of these things together. And so I'm working on the parking ZOTA with Chris. Chris is working on the open space ZOTA with me and the rest of my team. So we're really trying to come at these things from a coordinated approach. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is the open space ZOTA. So we're not quite as far along as the parking ZOTA. We haven't yet released any draft text for folks to look at. And so what I'll be sharing with you will be a little less information, a little more high level overview. And we'll be coming back to you, or maybe not to this particular group, but hopefully folks from this group will, sign up to be notified for updates on this ZOTA as well, because as soon as we get that draft text out there, we're going to be wanting to get lots of feedback. So let's just talk for a second about what we mean by open space, because I think it can be a fairly vague term, but it's something that planners really think about a lot. So open spaces in a planning sense are where we live our public lives. It's where we are living our community focused lives. So when we're outside of our houses, our offices, our cars, our classrooms, we're in open space. And buildings and streets really tend to provide the boundaries of our open spaces. And the way that buildings and streets and open spaces relate to one another is really important in creating the types of places where people feel welcome and where people feel comfortable. Open space is not the leftover space between buildings. I think that's really important to state. What we're talking about here is thinking, where do people live their public lives? How do we design the open space for them to live those lives? And then we think about how the buildings and the streets frame that space. So with this particular text amendment, we're talking about neighborhood scale open spaces. So we know that open space in neighborhoods is a critical element of the social infrastructure. It's where people live their social lives in neighborhoods. It could be at the scale of a small corner plaza or a pocket park or a vegetable patch in an apartment courtyard garden. These are the types of open spaces where neighbors gather, and without them, our neighborhoods wouldn't be complete. So what we're recognizing with this ZOTA is that just the same way we have regulations for the size and the height and the placement of buildings, we also need to have regulations that ensure that during new development, we get open spaces that serve the neighborhood. So we're focusing on neighborhood open spaces like the ones pictured here that would be provided by developers as part of new development. And all of this is grounded in our comprehensive plan goals and objectives. And these are all, council unanimously approved these goals and objectives. And in theme A, which is about neighborhoods, we have an objective that says incorporate adequate green space and open space into all development projects which serve the needs of the intended population. So this is a really clear objective. It's not ambiguous. We have a directive from council here. But to meet this goal, we're going to need a really coordinated effort, which leverages all of our different types of open spaces and green spaces. And these could be both public open spaces and privately owned, publicly accessible open spaces. We're going to have everything working together to make sure that we're getting that quality of life that Lexington is asking for. And our responsibility in planning begins with the way that we develop land. And we need to make sure that we're getting that open space, that it's being intentionally planned during the development process. So from that objective, there is a comprehensive plan policy action item, and this is aimed internally at us staff, and it says amend the zoning ordinance to redefine open space requirements. So we know we've got to do this, and there's actually an entirely blank section of the zoning ordinance that is reserved for these new standards. So it's a task that needs to be done. And our comprehensive plan is echoed by the 2018 Parks and Recreation Master Plan. So for their plan, they hired a consultant and they found some interesting things. 63% of households in Lexington are underserved by small neighborhood parks. 34% list too far from home as the reason for not using parks, but the national average is only 12%. And small neighborhood parks were the second most needed behind walking and hiking trails. You can visualize some of this by looking at this map. So this is also from the Parks Master Plan, and this was done by their consultant. And what you see is that within those green shapes, that's where if you live within that, you can walk within 10 minutes to a neighborhood park. And only about 40% of our population currently can walk to a neighborhood park in 10 minutes. So it's important here to stop for a minute and just say that we're not wanting to conflate public parks with the types of open spaces that would be required by this ZOTA. The zoning ordinance regulates the development on private land. But again, we recognize that open spaces on private land can provide a lot of the same benefits to our community as public parks. And we need to leverage all of those spaces if we want to meet these really broad goals. Also, the consultant for the Parks Master Plan produced this map, which shows where parks are needed during new development. Again, though publicly owned parks aren't the only way to meet the need. There's also common open spaces that are owned and maintained by HOAs or apartment associations or neighborhood associations, public-private partnerships, corporate sponsored open spaces and foundations like the Town Branch Partners. What we're seeing is that we're in an age where cities can't really rely solely on publicly owned open spaces to meet their needs anymore. And our Parks Master Plan has acknowledged that Lexington is no different. So our Parks Master Plan has a really clear goal. It says increase the population served within a 10-minute walk of a neighborhood park or larger from the current 40% to 65% through development of existing parkland, new parks and growing areas, including developer contributions and improved access to existing parks. So this is an incremental approach to getting everybody 100%, right? Everybody in Lexington within walking distance to a neighborhood park. And that goal is supported by national standards as well. So the National Recreation and Park Association, the Trust for Public Land, and the Urban Land Institute all came together to come up with a 10-minute walk campaign. And they want to see everybody in our country within a 10-minute walk of a park by 2050. And another set of national industry standards, which come from LEED for neighborhood development. And what they're saying is to locate 90% of planned and existing dwelling units and non-residential use entrances within a quarter mile or a 5-minute walk of at least one civic and passive use space. And what they mean by civic and passive use space is these are open spaces, common areas, community-focused gathering places. So what we have the opportunity to do here with this ZOTA is base our new standards for open space on both national best practices and our own local goals. So where are we now? We do have open space requirements in our zoning ordinance, but it's mentioned in a lot of different places. It's scattered across all these different articles similar to our current parking regulations. The definition of what's considered usable open space is really ambiguous. It's difficult to measure. And maybe most importantly, the standards that we do have for open space don't apply in some areas where they should. So to illustrate that, with the exception of the development that happens in our expansion areas where we have the expansion area master plan in some different zoning categories, our detached single dwelling neighborhoods like this neighborhood, this is in Southwest Lexington, they're just left out of the equation when it comes to community focused open space. And we know that the residents in neighborhoods like this benefit from having private open spaces in their backyards, but their need for community-focused open space is clearly not diminished. So, development in Lexington hasn't always been like this. Many of our older neighborhoods do have walkable parks and open spaces. Not to mention, a lot of those older neighborhoods have a greater variety of housing choice and missing middle housing types like duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes. But our zoning ordinance kind of went silent on requiring community-focused open spaces and an update that happened back in the 1980s. Prior to that, there was an article in the zoning ordinance which incentivized and provided standards for community park and recreation areas. So there's a couple of, or I guess there's three big issues with what we currently have right now for open space requirements. First, we have an inefficient setup. Things are scattered around. The definition is really complex. In our multi-dwelling or our multifamily uses, we do have an open space requirement, but it's because of the ambiguous definition, we're not always getting spaces that are intentionally planned for use by people. And then in the single dwelling, the single family detached environment, we just don't have a requirement for community focused open space. But we know that we need to make sure that any new development is creating an equitable, complete neighborhood. And a lot of our existing neighborhoods that do have good access to parks and community focused open spaces are considered a luxury. So we're creating some inequities there. So that brings us to our proposal, which is to take minimum usable open space, which is what we currently define and require in some places, and change that to consolidate that into combined open space. So that's going to pull everything into one article of the zoning ordinance, and we'll call it combined open space. So this gives us a lot of efficiency as well. And what combined open space will be the sum of two distinct types of open spaces, which can be defined and measured separately. Vegetated areas, so that will be the green stuff, and then common areas, which is the places that are intentionally planned for people to gather. So we drew this as a Venn diagram because we recognize that these two types of open spaces aren't mutually exclusive. So a common area with a lot of hardscape like this would count towards count towards your common area requirement. And a vegetated area that doesn't have anything in it for people to be able to access would count as vegetated area. But there are these types of hybrid landscapes that maybe are treating stormwater, but have some paths through them so that people can access it, that would be able to count for both. And we think that this would really incentivize, especially on smaller infill sites, getting good quality open spaces that are checking a lot of boxes, right? They're dealing with stormwater, they're places for people to gather. And this is just another example of how a vegetated area and a vegetated area plus common area, might be able to do some overlapping. So what are we planning to regulate? In the multi-dwelling, the uses, we're not going to be asking for more than what's already required. Most likely we'll be asking for slightly less combined open space in exchange for better quality common areas. In the single family or the single dwelling context, we would be adding a new requirement because we don't currently have a minimum usable open space requirement there. So we will be asking for something. What we're planning to regulate in terms of the vegetated area would be pretty limited, just has to be green growing stuff. But we do want to add some incentives to try to get more ecologically productive landscapes, and also incentives to help with preserving and restoring our environmentally sensitive areas. For the common areas, again, these are the places for people, intentionally planned for use for people. We'll be introducing a set of standards that make sure that these are accessible, that they're of a size and dimension that is usable by people, that they're visible, right? I can see into the space and it feels safe, that the adjacent uses activate instead of detract from the open space. Minor physical improvements, we're talking like benches, walkways, some requirements for plantings and trees, pedestrian scale lighting, a maximum slope. So this can't just be the honeysuckle slope behind the building, and also providing some standards when green infrastructure is used to make sure that that is actually an amenity for the people who would be using the common area. And then this is just, an example of the type of vegetated and common open areas that these standards would be aimed at getting more of. So again, we've got open spaces that are visible from the street, open spaces that are visible from people's front doors. You can look out the window, you can see your kids playing out there. These are active spaces that are primary, right? They're being used to lay out the kind of hierarchy, as opposed to just being tucked behind the leftover spaces, right? We want these to be intentional. And again, I'll just leave with this image, which is, the view, the perspective of what it would be like to be in these spaces, we're hoping. Without these open spaces, I think, what the comprehensive plan is saying is that to have complete neighborhoods, we need to incorporate this type of neighborhood focused open space. And we feel it's really important to creating more equitable neighborhoods. So I will end my slideshow there. And I think we went over our time a little bit, but these were two really big pieces of regulation change that we wanted to bring to you all tonight. And we really appreciate you sticking with us as we talk about so much and filled your brains with so much information.
Well, thank you both. I mean, it really is excellent information. And I definitely thank you both and the rest of your teams for this work, because, even as Chris was talking about, that these are gradual changes. Some of them are shorter term rather than longer term, but I think, people on this call, I have realized too, we have to do these now for our city to be what we hope it is in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years. We got here, the way things are now, that we have to update them. And while they're long-term changes, it's even more important that we do them now. So just thank you all for this work. I think that both of these ZOTAs and updates truly can have like tremendous impacts on just the way that we live. I think that, going back to Chris's comments about parking, I actually think there should probably be a separate regulation just for Chick-fil-A. I'm just saying, if you all need to do that, you can. But no, so thank you all. I am going to, first of all, I would love for anyone to put questions that they have in the chat. We had a couple of questions that were submitted. We asked when people registered to submit questions. So I want to make sure that we ask those and get to those. And then I would certainly encourage everyone to put questions that they have in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And I think Chris touched on this, and Valerie, I'm not sure if this was something that you all analyzed as you're thinking about open space, but I think from the parking standpoint, it's well worth emphasizing and mentioning again. The question is, do you all have a general idea of how much parking and open space requirements contribute to the cost of housing in Lexington? Or is there a particular model that you use to measure that?
Yeah, for parking, yes, we have some data from an international. Again, I think it's really important to point out that we compare ourselves to a lot of cities when we talk about some of these text amendments. And I said this in front of the Planning Commission too. And then everybody likes to say, well, we're not that city and we're not that city. But when it comes to parking regulations, we are every city across the country. We've all done our parking requirements the exact same way. It's having almost a universal impact in terms of cost on every city. Every city does have some different land economic issues that make the impact sometimes a little bit different. But we have looked at a study that's really useful from the Victoria Transport Policy Institute on affordable housing and the impact on affordable housing. We talked about that with the affordable housing parking ZOTA that we got through last year, and there's a big increase on the cost of housing, anywhere from 5 to 25% for every space you include in a development, and that scales up in terms of the cost to that individual unit based on how affordable that unit is. So if you have a low income unit where the rents are cheaper and then you require a lot of parking, the construction cost, just by the virtue of how much that fixed cost is to provide parking, becomes a bigger share of the rents on that individual unit. So the lower the price of the unit, perversely, the more expensive a percentage of that development it is taken up in parking, which is why parking standards in and of themselves, where we require parking that's not needed, is a regressive policy. It has a much bigger impact on the people who don't use it and don't pay for it and don't need it. Well, they do pay for it. They have to pay for it in their rents, but they're not using that parking, but it's baked into their rents and baked into the cost of development. And so it ranges, Brittany, from 5% to 15, 20, 25%. Again, it depends on the type of housing unit, the location of those housing units, and some of the land economics that are involved there.
And from the open space perspective, it's complicated, right? And it depends on the type of neighborhood that we're thinking about as well. I mean, taking it on its face value, if you were just thinking about open space and saying, well, we're going to be requiring open space and we're going to be requiring it to be improved in some way, of course, that's a cost. But when we consider that as part of the rest of the pie chart, with parking hopefully going down, and with buildings hopefully getting either a little bit larger or density being added in some other gentle ways, like through duplexes and triplexes and quads, then these things start to balance each other out. And what we end up with is something that is livable. And the benefits to that, I think, are something that we really are trying to stress here. And I guess the other side of it too is that with open space, it's pretty much the case that we don't see developments, even our large single family swaths of developments. Sorry if you hear my kid crying in the background. This happens every time I have an evening meeting. But
Zoom.
yeah. But, you know, we almost never see these larger developments come in without extensive amounts of undevelopable land on them, right? Whether it's a greenway or a floodplain. So, you know, the opportunities for carving more intentional spaces out of that for neighborhoods to use exist. And then we're not really talking about taking up any additional land.
I think those both of you all make really, really important points, and it gets to one of the other questions, that is, you know, do you see these changes allowing for more missing middle housing? And I'll ask you all to comment on that as well. But I will say that both of these changes and edits and updates, excuse me, to the zoning ordinance not only allow for just encourage better utilization of the land that we have, right? We're allowing more housing to be built instead of more parking, and you know, regulating that to what's actually needed, and then better utilization of the land that we have for the qualities that make it a desirable place to live. So you've got more housing, which decreases the cost of housing in general, and then you've got an increase in quality of life with the utilization of open space. Do you all want to elaborate any more on how these changes can contribute and enable more missing middle housing to be built here in Lexington?
Yeah, one point real quick is that, you know, the housing market study, like you said, mentioned the need for different housing types. Some of those housing types under our existing requirements were almost impossible to build. And so it's not about going in and saying, well, we don't allow fourplexes or we don't allow certain types of townhouses. We allow them, but our other regulations make them virtually impossible to build under the costs of land in Fayette County. So it has to be addressed through the things that we are already over-regulating. And it's not that they weren't over-regulated in the 70s when we created these standards. In the 70s, land was cheap. And so it was easy to build and make a development pencil out in a pro forma where land was at that price with the standards we have in place. The problem is we didn't touch them for 50 years. And the land economics have changed drastically. And so where a fourplex might have worked then, it can't work now. Where townhouses could have worked somewhere else, they can't work now. You know, one of the things we've put into the parking zone that I didn't have a chance to touch on is we've created a shared parking court for townhouses, so that every development doesn't necessarily have to have a 2-car driveway cut in. And we create all these curb cuts. We make it so that the pedestrians can't walk to there without having to back a car in. Plus, you can't use the street for parking. And one of the things we stress in this parking text amendment is the need to utilize street parking, because street parking slows cars down. It makes the street safer. And so and when you slow traffic down, you know, people feel welcome to go out there on their bikes or walk. And then once those are inviting spaces, then that becomes a very desirable housing type and a very desirable neighborhood once the cars aren't flying down the road. And so, you know, we're looking to not just create an opportunity for the ordinance to allow these things, but we also want to make them more desirable so that people choose that housing type. And so it's not considered a detriment or some second tier, second class housing type. We feel like these are top-notch housing products if we can make sure that we've provided the amenities in a way that makes them livable and desirable.
Absolutely. There are so many advantages, I think, and we're really by making these updates, clearing the way for the types of housing that we want to see as a community, and that we need desperately to meet the needs that we have. So another question is, let's see, will this ZOTA allow for community gardens or any type of Zone A activity? Uh,
I think that must be aimed towards the open space ZOTA.
Yeah.
And I think that the answer to that, I'm not sure what the zone A activity refers to, but I think that maybe they can
I think they
clarify.
just mean general agricultural activities. When they say zone A, I think they probably like the AR zone activities. So agriculture, I would assume.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So just growing food. I don't see why not. I think that that's something that we might, want to encourage or perhaps incentivize in some way. So with these being neighborhood focused open spaces, I think that, the neighborhood should decide how they want to have them used. The goal of our text amendment is to make sure that the space exists.
Gotcha.
Right, and that it's being planned for during development, and then the neighborhoods decide how they want to program. And one interesting thing that I learned from talking with our friends in Parks and Rec about this is that they have activities, the sort of mobile programming activities that they can do, and they're excited at the thought of being able to come into some of these new types of neighborhood focused open spaces that aren't capital P parks and help neighborhoods figure out how they can program those spaces for themselves, how they can make them into productive landscapes if they want to, or they can grow food or manage stormwater there. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for these to, be what the neighborhoods want them to be.
Yeah, we don't do anything to say you can't do a community garden in some of these spaces, but the problem is there's a lot of them as they exist now. Why would you want to? They're not accessible. They're not visible. They don't invite you in. They don't even make you think you're supposed to be there. They make you feel like you're trespassing because it's not designed in a way to make it clear that this is a place where the public wants you to be. And so if our open space is designed to say this is clearly a space where people are supposed to be, then we know we can start doing some activities in there.
Yeah, I think those are good points that this is really kind of encouraging all of those opportunities to be taken advantage of, and this paves the way for those opportunities to be done. Let's see, what role might residents play in helping to convert parking lots to green spaces? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Stop driving, drive less. That's we forced you to do that, so it's not like we tell you to stop driving, because our ordinance for the dawn of time has told you to drive and made you drive. So tongue in cheek here, but we know from talking with commercial real estate people and property managers that the future of retail is not at all what it looks like today. It's what they call experiential retail, which means you go there to do something besides shopping. While you're there, you do some shopping, which means they want to convert their spaces to something where you will come and hang out. We've had numerous conversations with developers that are looking at trying to retrofit some of these spaces and create that event space, hangout space. There's a market for that because people want it, and the retail market is going to be reflecting that. It's already started in Lexington with some developments like the Summit and some other places. That's something that's at the front of their minds, is how to do it, but it's complicated and it takes time. What we've tried to do is create the regulations that allow them to do it, and then they call us and say, we've got some ideas, how can we do it? And then we try to work with them to get them there. But it's some of these places, they've never worked in an area where the parking wasn't so restrictive, and so they have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. I mean, the number of cities that have liberalized their parking ordinance is very small. There's a ton of cities trying to do it and are working on doing it and are basically where we're at right now in that process. But in terms of the places that have been able to pull it off, it's not a lot. And so our B6P ordinance is pretty ahead of its time. It's just takes time for the market to respond to that and react to it.
Right. I think that's a good point. Again, about the gradual changes that these ZOTAs enable. But I do want to mention another piece of this. You all talked about when you're looking at a site, the three most important pieces of what you're looking at are open space, parking requirements, and then floor area ratio. And so we know that the floor area ratio, or FAR ZOTA, was passed last year. And I want to, if you all can talk about what the impacts have been from the passing of that ZOTA, because it does seem like that is one that actually did have immediate impacts. And I think that those impacts are really important for people to understand as well, that there are ZOTAs that will have these longer term impacts, and there are ZOTAs that can change things immediately, and how these pieces work together.
Yeah, the FAR ZOTA, we documented very clearly a 30-year trend where the R3 zone was essentially becoming non-functional based on the land prices in Fayette County. If you had R3 zoned land, that if it wasn't a certain size, you couldn't develop it. And we were seeing an exorbitant number of zone changes to other zones, which really raises the cost of development, which then has an impact on the cost of housing. We looked at other areas of the country and figured out, where's a reasonable place for our floor area ratio to sit, so that development is still respectful of its adjacent context, but will allow you to do something with it that's useful without almost a year-long process for a zone change, not to mention the time, but the expense. And we set out to create our R3, R4, and R5 standards for residential to basically be 3-story, 4-story, 5-story. And there's really nowhere in Fayette County that in terms of our urban service area where 3 stories should not be an acceptable height. Even in a neighborhood setting, 3 stories, most houses, by the time you add their roof lines and attics and spaces like that, some have 3 stories, but a 2 to 3 story difference, that's contextual. That works. That should work everywhere. So we set out to create a 3-story, 4-story, 5-story zoning regime for those zones, so that no matter the size of your lot, the FAR would allow you to get to a 3-story building in an R3 and up to a 5-story building in an R5. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't go higher, but your parking and your open space are going to start limiting it back down. Your setbacks, what we call our height to yard ratios for the setbacks, are going to kick in. The other things are going to be limiting what they can do on the development. It just won't be the really low floor area ratio that was just like a big old wet blanket on top of everything. And we saw within the first few months, 2 or 3 development plans that came in that would have been, they were marginally over the old FAR within, a few percentage points, but we just saved that development the need of 6 months of zone change to make a development that could now pencil out on a pro forma that would work. And I know not everybody is, enamored with new development and adding new housing, but it's critically important for us to be able to have this stuff and do it in a scale that's not intrusive and overwhelming. And I think the FAR ZOTA has done that. It's at least given us a relief valve. We've not seen anything yet that has been, oh, what have we done? We made it, we went too far. But we know that we're going to try to start pulling some of these other levers on the open space and parking, so that we don't have those things dictating the design within that framework. That's the other piece of it is, just because we've allowed a little bit higher density, it can't be well designed when you've got to fill it with parking and squeeze it to the middle. That doesn't work for Lexington in 2020. It might have worked in suburban Lexington in 1970, but we are a much bigger city now, and we have to think in those terms.
Absolutely. And like I said, I do think that's important for all of us as community members to understand that sometimes when these ZOTAs go through, they do have those immediate impacts. 2 or 3 developments that were able to avoid the time and cost of attorney's fees and zone changes and all of that to get the type of housing built that we want to see is really important, I think.
Brittany, there was one other one we did with the affordable housing parking that sort of merged the FAR and the affordable housing parking into one development. We had a development that came in before both of those text amendments. And then as soon as they were done, they came back in, dropped, I can't remember exactly how many spaces, but then utilized that extra space to provide another 10 to 15 affordable units. So in that situation, the tangible impact was you get extra housing units for people who can least afford it, reduce parking where, on average, 60% of people living in affordable housing don't own a car, much less 2, which is what we were requiring per unit. And so it's a total win all the way around. And so, does anybody notice that? Probably not. I don't think anybody driving by would notice the impact of that, but I think the residents and people who need affordable housing, they certainly notice it.
I think that is a great point. This is a question regarding open space, Valerie. What are some of the trends that we're seeing nationally related to open space, and how have those kind of been incorporated in what we're proposing here in Lexington?
Well, I think that the two biggest trends that we're seeing right now nationally are, I mean, everybody is sort of coming to terms with how critically important having access to open space is. I mean, think about during the pandemic, how that has changed the way that we use our neighborhoods, and our parks and our trails. Usage on parks and trails has just skyrocketed over the last year and a half. And I think that it is in some ways a really wonderful sort of renaissance moment for people recognizing how important these spaces are to them, how important they are to their communities. But on the flip side of that, I think people are also recognizing that the budget to maintain and to acquire new open spaces and trails, and all of these things that make our community so wonderful has dwindled, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. We've allowed some really unsustainable development patterns. This is not just in Lexington. This is nationally, that have made it difficult for the government to keep up, right, with the sort of, we haven't been very fiscally responsible. Sprawl is not fiscally responsible, right? So I think that the challenge is going to be, nationally, what we're seeing is that people need these open spaces. They're more important than ever, but we're struggling to be able to pay for them as a government. So some of the trends that we're seeing have to do with these public-private partnerships and privately owned, publicly accessible open spaces. I think that there will continue to be a huge role played by the government in owning and maintaining larger sort of regional parks. But as we get down into the smaller neighborhood serving scale, I think that's where other cities and Lexington, I think we need to be moving that direction as well, are going to have to be looking at different models, because it's not sustainable for us as a government to be able to own, maintain, program those spaces.
And can you all speak a little bit to how, community members that believe in these changes, or I suppose oppose these changes, can advocate for these? I know you all mentioned the resources on imaginelexington.com, and Ashley did put those resources in the chat. So I would certainly encourage anyone that is on the call with us to check those out online and look at the options where you can engage. But I'd love to hear both of your all's thoughts on how people can engage if they want to advocate for these policies or provide input.
Well, I'll just say, we do want people to reach out to us, and if they care about this, and let us come and talk to them, let us make the case. I think a lot of the onus on getting these things over the hump is on us as public servants to explain not just why they're good, but why they're necessary. There's a cost to the community of doing nothing. I know that not everybody likes every change that we put forward, and of course they're not going to. But I think one of the things that we try to do is to educate on what the cost of not doing anything is. And there is a very high cost to the community of maintaining the status quo. And it would mean all sorts of negative things to everyone in this community if we continue the patterns that we've always maintained. And so, we wanted to make the case. We want to talk to folks, even the people who hate what we're trying to do, because it's a good opportunity to, at the bare minimum, explain why we're doing it, why we're recommending it. And so we encourage anyone, if they want to get involved, to reach out to us, invite us out to your neighborhood meetings, any meeting that you have. We're happy to come and talk about these things. And then good or bad, we want you to let the planning commission and the council members know where you stand. And at a minimum, we hope that people will tell them, well, planning came out and took the barbs and was happy to answer for it, but we just don't agree. And that's okay. We don't expect that we'll convert everybody. But we really enjoy getting out and talking to folks and trying to educate on what the issues are, because I think a lot of people don't realize that there is a problem that's trying to be solved, that it's not just change for the sake of change, and that the Lexington they may have come here when they, what it was like when they came here and moved here is a very different place for a lot of other people. And it's different for new people to this community, lower income people to this community, that when they moved here, it may have been very affordable to them, but it's not very affordable to most new people today. And helping people to understand, what everyone else is experiencing, I think is a very helpful thing. And then if we don't agree, we don't agree. And so, I certainly want everyone that has strong feelings on this to get involved with their council members and let them know that these issues are important, because, it's very hard to get these big things in front of council and then get them over the hump. And so we've had some things we've managed to get through that are important, like the FAR ZOTA and the affordable housing parking and the B6P changes, but we've had others like the accessory dwelling units that we haven't been able to get over the hump. And we think that's a really important small piece of an overall strategy, that if we do lots of little things, that the impact and burdens on any one neighborhood or any one group of people will be minimized. But we have to attack the problems of affordability and equity across the board in lots of little ways. And if we do that, we'll make a big difference. And so, whether you agree or disagree, we really do want you to let your council members know that you at least want these things to get a vote and get their hearing, get their time in front of everybody, let everybody come and speak and say their piece. And then it falls where it may. And we're trying to cultivate advocacy, obviously, in the direction that we think things need to go. And we think Fate Alliance has been a great partner in these efforts. And it's really important. And so, I know there's folks on this call that may not agree with us, but we are thrilled that you're here, and we're thrilled to take your questions and talk to your groups as well.
And I think, it's a good point. Having these community conversations is so critical as we do this. So we appreciate you all being here. I want to end on one really good question, and then we'll wrap it up. So the question is, how much thought and priority is given to planning and designing, and probably to a lesser extent zoning, for encouraging public transit into some of these housing models, mainly as a way to accommodate people of varying income levels and to cut down on the need for parking? So that's a great question, just about how transportation planning integrates into the work that you all are doing.
Yeah. So Lexington's layout with the wheel and the spoke makes transit very, very difficult. And I'm not going to pretend to be a public transit expert or speak for LexTran, but they tell us this all the time when we work with them. We have transit on the spokes where it can be efficient. What we have is people who don't live on the spokes, because that's where our commercial corridors are. We have people who live in between the spokes. And so one of the big overarching goals of the comprehensive plan is to create housing opportunities where transit already exists, so that it can be more efficient. Because the ridership on these, if we can increase the ridership by bringing housing to where the transit is already serving, we can serve people who need it, and they don't have to, then they won't need as many cars. And we can make the gains that we spend on transit much more efficient. We can then, once we have ridership starting to trickle in and increase, the headways, they can invest to get those headways down, so they serve those those developments faster. It starts with land use. It starts with the zoning ordinance. It starts with us allowing housing to be built in places where it hasn't been allowable before. And so the commercial corridors, putting residential on our commercial corridors and then serving it with transit that's already there is the key to making transit work and reducing. And then that'll take care of some of the parking demand on its own, or parking inventory on its own, because that's where some of that development will go. The Imagine Nicholasville Road study was all about land use first, and turning the transit that's there into bus rapid transit and creating dedicated infrastructure so that we can, prioritize that traffic. And the people will go, hey, if that bus gets signal priority and gets to its destination faster than I can drive, and I don't have to sit in traffic, maybe on the margins, people will start to make a different choice about how they get somewhere. And so we're trying to prioritize the land use that will make that mode of transportation better. And so I hope that answers your question as to the approach we're trying to take.
And that was a great question. And I think, that's a whole other session too, right? That we can talk about
really is.
the importance
It really
of
is.
the importance of transit, but that is a really important piece. So I appreciate that question and you speaking to how that fits into the bigger picture. I know Ashley linked Imagine Nicholsville Road in the chat as well. Would highly recommend checking that out. That speaks to what Chris was just talking about. It's really interesting to see. That's a big vision for Lexington, but it's how we need to change our mindset around how transit is related to housing development and density on our corridors where the infrastructure already exists, which also goes to reduce the cost of housing. So
I see his question. The text there says, how much thought and priority is given? The answer to that is a lot. We're framing everything we do around all modes of transportation. We're trying to put all modes of transportation on equal footing and make sure that transit is at the table and in the thoughts and in the planning and development of every single thing we do in both the text amendments on the big picture and when the development plans come in. But it's harder to argue for those things on a development plan when they're not in the ordinance. And so we can ask the Planning Commission and we can recommend it in the Planning Commission, but it's hard to require it until we get those changes into the ordinance. So it's two steps.
Well, thank you all so much for your time. This has been such a great discussion. I appreciate everyone's time on this beautiful evening for sticking with us. Special thank you to Chris and Valerie for offering so much excellent information. Again, I encourage you all to check out the links we've put in the chat. We will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone that attended the session that will include a recording. So watch out for that. Next week, we'll also make that available with some additional resources on our website. So please stay on the lookout for Fayette Alliance events via email. Check out our website, sign up for our newsletter if you don't already receive it, and also stay tuned on our social media channels for different events we'll be promoting. We will actually be beginning a district-wide neighborhood association tour in mid-April. So if you're interested in attending that, we're doing it by district, please stay tuned. Again, sign up for updates on our website and on social media. And so please follow us on Facebook and Instagram as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning of our session tonight, Fayette Alliance is a nonprofit that is funded by engaged citizens like all of you. So if you all enjoyed tonight's content, please consider donating on our website. Your contribution, no matter how big or small, truly helps us continue this work and offering sessions like these. So once again, thank you all so much. If you have additional questions or thoughts or feedback, feel free to email us at info@fayettealliance.com. We'll certainly get back to you. We love recommendations for topics for future Grow Smart Academy 2.0 sessions like this one. So again, thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.